Hello viewers, today let us examine the beautiful text Arabian Nights, also called the 1001 Nights or Kitab al-Liya Waliyah. Like the jinn who suddenly materializes and vanishes in its pages, Al-Liya Waliyah or the 1001 Nights is a book that is in many ways difficult to pin down. Indeed, exactly what texts and what stories constitute the nights has always been the subject of some disagreement. It is broadly understood to be a collection of West and South Asian stories and folk tales compiled in Arabic during the Golden Age of Islam. It is often known in the English as the Arabian Nights, which was first published in 1706, which rendered the title as the Arabian Nights Entertainment. The original manuscript of the stories are believed to be lost, but contemporary versions are available in Arabic, English and other languages. The style of the work, its influence on several literary works, film, music and range of its adaptations makes the 1001 Nights a significant work today. The source of the Arabian Nights. The earliest mention of a text which can be called a clear antecedent to the contemporary work is found in a papyrus dating from the 9th century AD. The papyrus mentions two characters, Dinazad and Shirazad, later to become Dunyazad and Shahrazad, and has a few lines of narrative in which the former asks the later to tell a story. There is also a mention of a title, the Book of Stories from the 1000 Nights, that anticipates the current title of the work, the 1001 Nights. About 100 years later, around the 10th century, two writers in Baghdad, Al-Masudi and Ibn an-Nadim, mention the same work. In his book Meadows of Gold, the historian Masudi mentions the work. In his bibliographic catalogue, Ibn an-Nadim mentions a work translated from Persian called the 1000 Stories. For the next 7 centuries, there are only two even briefer references to its existence. In the 12th century, a lone record for a Jewish bookseller in Cairo mentions the title The 1001 Nights, the earliest mention of its present title. Majd ibn al-Azizi has the 1001 Nights, and in the early 15th century, the Egyptian historian al-Makrizi cites authors who indicate the work was in circulation in Cairo before the 11th century. These brief references, separated by long periods of time when the book all but vanishes from view, suggest an analogy with an unconscious thought that only infrequently and briefly makes its presence known in conscious thought and then quickly vanishes again. D.B. MacDonald, in an important article published in 1924, The Early History of the Arabian Nights, divided its developments into 5 stages. First one, a Persian core, the 1000 Stories, Hazar Afsanah. Second one, an Arabic version of this, the frame story of the 1000 Stories with new Arabic stories added to it. Fourth, a late Fatimid version. And fifth, the Syrian recension, whose 16th century manuscript was the basis of the first European translation, that of Galland. To this, we may add a 6th and final stage suggested by Nadbia Abbott, a stage which extends into the 16th century and introduces the material from popular epics. There is also textual evidence, stories in the night, that bear unmistakable links to other works in medieval Arabic literature and to works in other literatures. Here, it will be useful to distinguish between these categories. The first category would contain stories that reveal its links with a specific work in medieval Arabic literature. For example, the story of the steward, told within the longer story of the Hunchback. It's roughly the same story recounted as fact by the 10th century author Al-Tuniki in his book Happiness After Hardship. It is a story of a husband who offends the delicate sensibility of his wife on their wedding night by forgetting to wash his hands after having eaten a certain spicy stew called zirbagah. Years later, the same dish is served at a banquet and the other dinners demand that he eat some of it. The unfortunate man washes his hands 120 times, then tells the story of his disastrous wedding night. The second category of the textual evidence contains stories in the 1001 Nights that make use of and revise the plots of extremely well-known stories in Islamic culture. Stories about figures like Abraham, Joseph, and Solomon are examples. Finally, in the third category are the stories which make use of plots which are even more widely spread, the Cinderella plot, the Phaedra plot, and so on. While the textual evidence its demonstrated links with other works may tell us something about the sort of literature that furnished the raw materials for the storytellers of the 1001 Nights and how they reworked it, that evidence does not tell us much about the specific content and shape of the text at any particular stage prior to the 14th century, roughly the date for the earliest Arabic manuscript available for study today. The literary style and technique in Arabian Nights. The 1001 Nights and various tales within it make use of many innovative literary techniques, which the storytellers of the tales rely on for increased drama, suspense, or other emotions. An early example of the frame story or framing device is employed in the 1001 Nights, in which the character Scheherazade narrates a set of tales, most often fairy tales, to the Sultan Shahryar over many nights. Many of Scheherazade's tales are also frame stories, such as the tale of Sinbad the Seaman and Sinbad the Landman, being a collection of adventures related by Sinbad the Seaman to Sinbad the Landsman. Another literary device prominent in the 1001 Nights is the embedded narrative. An example of the story within a story technique can be found in the 1001 Nights, which can be tracked back to earlier Persian and Indian storytelling traditions, most notably the Panchatantra of ancient Sanskrit literature. The Nights, however, improved on the Panchatantra in several ways, particularly in the way a story is introduced. In the Panchatantra, stories are introduced as didactic analogies. In the Nights, this didactic framework is the least common way of introducing the story, but instead of a story, is most commonly introduced through subtle means, particularly as answer the questions raised in a previous tale. The general story is narrated by an unknown narrator, and in the text, stories are told by Scheherazade. In most of Scheherazade's narrations, there are also stories narrated, and even in some of these, there are some other stories. This is particularly the case of Sinbad the Sailor, story narrated by Scheherazade in the 1001 Nights. Within the Sinbad the Sailor story itself, the protagonist Sinbad narrates the story of his 7 voyages to Sinbad the Porter. The device is also used to great effect in stories such as the 3 Apples and the 7 Viziers. In yet another tale, Scheherazade narrates the Fisherman and the Genie, and the tale of Wazir and Sage Duban is narrated within it, and within that there are 3 more tales that are narrated. The technique of dramatic visualization is widely used in the text. It indicates a technique where an object or character is represented within an abundance of descriptive detail or the mimetic rendering of gestures and dialogues in such a way as to make a given scene visual to an audience. A good example of this is the tale of the three apples. There is also an abundance of poetry in 1001 Nights. Characters use poetry to give advice, to praise God and royalty, plead for mercy and lament for the wrong decisions that they have taken, and for providing riddles. In a typical example, expressing feelings of happiness to oneself from the night 203, Prince Kamar al-Zaman, standing outside the castle, wants to inform Queen Budur of his arrival. He wraps his ring in a paper and hands it to the servant, who delivers it to the queen. When she opens it and sees the ring, joy conquers her, and out of happiness she chants a poem which describes her grief at separation and the joy of reunion that envelops her now. The Arabian Nights in Arab literature and connections with world literatures. There is little evidence that Nights was particularly treasured in the Arab world. It is rarely mentioned in the lists of popular literature, and few pre-18th century manuscripts of the collection exist. Fiction has a low cultural status among medieval Arabs and compared with poetry, and the tales were dismissed as khurafa, improbable fantasies fit only for entertaining women and children. It was also deemed lowly due to its linguistic style, improbable subject matter, and lack of self-censorship of the authors with respect to topics like illicit sex and wine. While looked upon with disdain in the Arab world as a whole, the Nights have provided an inspiration to some modern Egyptian writers such as Tawfiq al-Hakim, Taha Hussein, Naguib Mahfouz. The influence of the versions of the Nights on world literature is immense. Writers as diverse as Henry Fielding to Naguib Mahfouz have alluded to the work by name in their own literature. Other writers who have been influenced by the Nights include John Barth, George Louis Borges, Salman Rushdie, Goethe, Walter Scott, Thackeray, Marcel Proust, and A.S. Byatt. It has been influential in the West since it was translated in the 18th century first by Anthony Gollant. Many imitations were written, especially in France. Various characters from this epic have themselves become cultural icons in Western culture, such as Aladdin and Sinbad and Ali Baba. Several elements from Arabian mythology and Persian mythology are now common in modern fantasy, such as genies, magic carpets, magic lamps, etc. The Nights also had an influence on modern Japanese literature. George Filer Townsend's revised edition of the Arabian Nights was the first European literary work to be translated into the Japanese language during the Meiji era by Nagamine Hideki in 1875. The Nights didn't gain popularity in Japan until a more Japanified translation entitled Zenzike Ichide Kisho. The most curious book in the whole world was produced by Inoue Tsutomi in 1888. His translation exerted a great influence on the literature of the Meiji, Taisho, and Showa periods. In Norwegian Wood by Haruki Murakami, Toru refers to Riko as a regular Scheherazade when she leaves a story about a past unfinished. The summary of the Arabian Nights. The frame story. Two brothers, Shahryar and Shahzaman, rule over separate lands, the former over what is today India and Indochina, and the second over Samarkand. After 10 years, Shahryar sends his chief advisor, also called his vizier, to summon his brother to come to India for a visit. The vizier camps outside the city of Samarkand, and after Shahzaman returns to his palace. Following his visit to the camp, he finds his wife in bed with the cook. Outraged, he kills them both and then leaves to visit his brother. Then he learns that his brother's situation is even worse than his. He catches his brother's wife cheating with a slave. Shahryar is predictably outraged when he tells him, so together they leave the city to seek out a man who is even more unfortunate than they are. They head to the seashore on their quest. They see a demon emerge from the ocean with a glass chest containing a beautiful woman. When the demon is asleep, the woman demands that the two brothers sleep with her. After they do, she takes a ring from each of them to add to a collection of 98 rings from 98 lovers to show her scorn for the demon who keeps her trapped. The brothers realize to their delight the demon's fortune is clearly worse than their own, so they decide to return to their kingdoms. There, Shahryar has his wife killed and swears to marry a new woman each night and kill her in the morning so that she can't betray him. He does this for quite a while. The vizier's daughter, Scheherazade, decides she will marry the king to hopefully get him to stop killing his wives. Her father warns her against it and threatens her, but she goes with it anyway. She hatches a plan to avoid death. On her wedding night, her sister Dinarzad seeks her out and pleads for a story for her and Shahryar. Each night, Scheherazade will tell a story, but she won't finish it, instead leaving the ending off so that her husband won't kill her that night. The next night, she will finish the story and start a new one, but once again not finish it to keep him interested. This continues on for, as the title says, 1001 nights, until the king is changed and accepts her as his permanent wife. The story of the first night. The first night is a story of the merchant and the demon. A traveling merchant stops to rest and eat. He tosses date pits into the ground, washes and says his prayer. Suddenly there appears an old demon, sword in his hand, feet on the ground, head in the clouds, who says, I must kill you as you killed him, because one of the date pits the merchant tossed away stuck the demon's son and killed him. This is the justice of pre-Islamic law of blood for blood, no matter what the intentions of the people involved were. The merchant begs for forgiveness since he has killed unknowingly, but the demon is of the old school of pre-Islamic law and replies, by God, I must kill you as you killed my son. This, of course, parallels the situation of the king who is killing a woman every night to punish a woman long dead. It is punishment without determining the guilt. The pious merchant pleads, but the demon insists he must kill him. Dawn comes and Scheherazade stops the story right in the middle, but says she will tell an even better story if the king agrees to let her live until the next night. The king agrees, wanting to hear the end of the story, after which he thinks he will get her killed. The story on the second night. The demon agrees to let the merchant go home and put his affairs in order. The merchant swears to God that he will return by the New Year's Day. The demon accepts this because they both believe in the same God, even though the merchant is Muslim and the demon is from an earlier time and accepts an earlier law. True to his word, the merchant puts his affairs in order and returns on the New Year's Day. As he waits for the demon to kill him, an old man appears with a deer on a leash, hears the merchant's story, and says he will stay until he sees the outcome. The dawn comes and Scheherazade stops telling her story. The intrigued king agrees to let her live yet another day to tell the rest of the story. Another old man with two black dogs arrives, hears the merchant's story, and says he will stay to see the outcome. On the fourth night, the demon appears, and the first old man asks him if he will release 1/3 of the merchant's guilt if the old man can tell the demon a strange and wonderful story. The demon agrees, and the first man tells a story. He had a barren wife for 30 years, and then he took a mistress who bore him a son. His wife was jealous, and while the man was away, turned his mistress into a cow and the son into a bull. When the man returned, he was told that his mistress had died and his son had run away. On a feast day, at his wife's insistence, the old man sacrificed the cow, although the cow wept and otherwise behaved oddly. But it proved only skin and bones when dead. So at his wife's insistence, he was going to sacrifice the bull, but it threw itself at his feet and behaved pathetically. The story of the fifth night. The old man refused to kill the bull and sent him to live with a shepherd, whose daughter saw through the enchantment. She changed him back into a man after his father agreed to marry the bull son to her. She also changed the evil wife into a pretty deer, the very deer the old man had with him on a leash. The demon agrees that this is a strange and an amazing tale and grants 1/3 of the merchant's life. The second old man with the 2 dogs then says his story is even more strange and amazing, and the demon agrees to grant 1/3 of the merchant's life if the story proves to be so. The story is narrated on the 6th night. The second old man tells the story of himself and his 2 brothers, who squandered away their wealth each time he helped them to get onto their feet. Finally, they persuaded him to go on to a trading voyage. On the 7th night, the story is narrated further. They arrived at their destination, sold their goods at a nice profit, and the man telling the story met a girl dressed in tatters. She asked for a favor, and he agreed. The favor was that he would marry her, and she added that she would reward him for kindness and charity. He felt pity for her, and guided by what God the Most High had intended, he consented. On the voyage home, the 2 brothers became jealous and tossed him and his new wife overboard. The wife turned into a she-demon and carried him to safety on an island. She wanted to kill the evil brothers, but her husband refused, so she flew him to his home, where he found 2 dogs waiting. The demon, whose sons was killed by the merchant's date pit, agrees that the story is indeed strange and amazing, and grants another 1/3 of the man's life to the second old man. The third old man then seeks if the demon will grant him the last third of the merchant's life if his story is even more strange and amazing. The story-loving demon agrees to this bargain. And now, the story of the 8th night. The third old man tells the story of his mule. When the old man had surprised his wife in bed with a slave, his wife turned him, the old man, into an old dog. He ran to a butcher shop where the butcher's daughter recognized him, that he was a man in a dog form. She sprinkled him with magical water and restored him to human form. The old man then asked for a bit of magical water, which he used to turn his wife into the mule who accompanies him. The demon, amazed and swaying with delight, grants the final third of the merchant's life. The old demon leaves, and the merchant thanks the 3 old men and returns home. Shahrazad remarks that the story was not as strange and amazing as the story of the fisherman, and the sisters say on cue, "Please, what story?" And Shahrazad begins a new set of stories that will continue for several nights. The king is hooked on the stories by now, and we know they will go on and on. Stories from the 1001 Nights have been popular subjects for films, beginning with George Méliès' film in 1905. The best-known film based upon the Nights is Walt Disney's Aladdin, an animated musical adventure featuring Robin Williams as the voice of the genie. The 2 versions of The Thief of Baghdad a two-part television miniseries adapted in 2000 for BBC and ABC Studios, and the film Arabian Nights, directed by Steve Barron, are among the best-known adaptations of the work. There is also a Japanese animated version of 1001 Nights, directed by Osamu Tezuka and Eiichi Yamamoto. In 2012, Vancouver-based Big Bad Boo Studios released the first ever animated 1001 Nights for children. The show launched on Teletoon and aired in 80 countries around the world, including Discovery Kids. The Nights has inspired many pieces of music: Renaissance, Shahrazade and Other Stories, Fikret Amirov, Arabian Nights, Davies Aladdin, Camelot, Nights of Arabia, Sarah Brightman, Harem and Arabian Nights. There have also been several video games based on the works, such as Nadirim, a game placed in a fantasy world inspired by the tales of 1001 Nights. Dear learners, we come to the end of the lesson on the Arabian Nights. It is a fascinating text. Hope you'll be inspired by this lesson to read the text in detail and enjoy it. It was nice meeting you. Thank you.